All right. Well, hopefully you had fun with that and maybe heard it, maybe didn't. I don't know. Um, some other sensory changes across adulthood that we observe have to do with taste and smell. Um, for the average person around age 50, they'll start to say that certain foods don't taste as good as they used to, or they may start to put more salt on their food. Um, Here's a graph that shows you self-reported problems with the sense of taste. This was pre-COVID, by the way, since that's a symptom of COVID. This is not a COVID-related thing. This is just normal development, where you see, if you look at the very bottom, you see 18 to 39 years old. You see very few people per 1,000, by the way. So this is maybe 3 out of 1,000 18 to 39-year-olds will say that they don't really taste very well, or that they're tasting something differently than other people do, or something like that. Between 40 and 59, now we're getting up to about 7 out of 1,000 adults complaining about that same problem. By the time a person's over 60, now we're looking at, more than 15% of people saying that they have some degree of taste problem. Now you'll notice in the kind of lavender area, it says what they complain of, and there's inappropriate taste. So a lot of times that'll be like, they'll say it tastes tinny, or something like that. It tastes like metallic, or problem tasting salt, where they go, no, this needs more salt, I can't taste it at all. Or problem tasting sugar, this isn't sweet enough for me. And then the larger group is, something else. They're having some other complaint about their taste. Now, historically, one of the biggest contributors to dull sense of taste and smell has been smoking. Smoking really can dull your taste buds so that they really just don't react to food and drink like they had before. And same thing with your sense of smell. But now that fewer and fewer adults are smoking, we're seeing fewer people actually having this problem of complaining about problems with their sense of taste. By the way, sense of taste and smell tend to go together. And so if a person's complaining about these taste sensations, they might also be complaining about flavor. Like it doesn't smell like coffee, or my coffee tastes strange, because they are not really getting the scent. Now, what about strength? Still sticking with, very physical things here. Most people will experience about a 20% decrease in strength over the 40 years of adulthood. So if you compare a 25-year-old to a 65-year-old, you're going to see about a 20% difference in strength. And so for most people, that means that they're really not going to notice it, and they're not going to really say, I'm that much weaker. Here we have by age group and by sex. So the males are in the blue bars and the females are in the purple bars. And, if you look at the 40 to 59-year-olds, compared to the 20 to 39-year-olds, it's just a small drop off, like a 4% change for the males, a 2% change for the females. So it's like a little small drop off that we're seeing during the age group that we're talking about. By the time you get to 60, because again, this graph nothing really is ever designed to go exactly with developmental psychology. So we would say that this age group ends about age 65. So that would be some of those people in the 60 to 79-year-old period probably belong over where we're talking about. And so we would probably be talking about, a change from, mean grip strength of 97 when you're, 25 to 39. And maybe by the time you're 65, you'd be talking about a mean grip strength of maybe 80, something like that. So it's about a 20% decrease across this time period. And like I said, most people don't really notice the change. In fact, to a 25-year-old, the idea that a 65-year-old would think, no, I could probably arm wrestle you, and might be serious about it, might seem strange. But to the 65-year-old, they're like, I think I'm stronger than I was before. And part of why they might think that they're stronger than they ever were, that they're just as strong as they ever have been, might be because they know how to compensate for the small changes in their strength. Like they've got better strategies for lifting, or better strategies for holding on to things than they might have had when they were younger. And so a lot of times it's not just being delusional that the older person thinks, that they could still compete with a younger person. It could be honestly that their experience in the world feels very similar that it has across their adult lifetime. Speaking of which, though, exercise. You will lose muscle if you don't exercise. So maintaining a fitness routine throughout adulthood is really super important. Now, do you have to do this crazy fitness routine that I'm showing you here? In the top picture, we have a cross section of the thighs of a 40-year-old triathlete. And it kind of looks like, I don't mean to be rude to a human, but kind of looks like a slice of ham, doesn't it? It's like, that's a lot of muscle with just a little ring of, some subcutaneous fat around the muscle, right? A little bit of marbling, we might say. In the middle, you see a 74-year-old sedentary man. And so you see that it's almost exclusively adipose tissue, which is a nice way of saying fat, and just a little bit of muscle mass, like very little. But if you look at the next level down, that's a 70-year-old who's still a triathlete. And look at all the muscle mass. In fact, one of the reasons why a 70-year-old triathlete probably looks a little more wiry than a 40-year-old triathlete is because the 70-year-old doesn't have as much fat, subcutaneous fat. Notice that difference between the 70-year-old and the 40-year-old. But so I'm not trying to suggest we all have to be triathletes. I'm definitely not suggesting that. But I think we can all agree that the 74-year-old in the middle, that doesn't look like that person probably goes for many walks. I mean, look at even just the bone in the middle is so much smaller than the bone in the triathletes of either age, right? That person is at risk of breaking a femur if they fell, right? The 74-year-old sedentary man is at risk of breaking a bone because those bones aren't very dense. So just adding walking, weightlifting, some resistance of some sort, these kinds of things will help to keep the bones stronger, keep the muscle mass bigger relative to fat, and contribute to a healthier person in the long run. It used to be believed that as you got older, muscle just naturally atrophied. And we now know that that's not true, that across your entire lifespan, you can maintain your strength. You can maintain your stamina if you continue to exercise and to pursue active hobbies and things like that. And you can, in fact, maintain muscle mass. I think the 70-year-old triathlete is a great example of that you can maintain muscle mass. I mean, if I hadn't told you their ages, I don't think you would have been able to tell which one was 40 and which one was 70 in this picture. So that's my advocacy for a healthy exercise-filled lifestyle. How about reaction time? I've shown you before, like the peg task where you move little, basically, checkers from one post to another. Here's another way of measuring reaction time, and this is where lights are going to go off on this little board, and you're supposed to push the correct button as quickly as you can. So there's different ways that we can measure reaction time. Again, we see about a 20% decrease, or I guess we would say increase in reaction time, right? Because reaction time gets longer with age. As we get older, we are a little slower to react. One of the best things that an older person who today currently is 60 or older, that they could start to include in their lives is some kind of video game, believe it or not. Now, there probably are some 60-year-olds who have been playing video games, so I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about those who, video games came along when they were already, adults and weren't really ever playing it. Maybe even their kids own them, but the adult never really played them. Those are the perfect candidates for adding some video games into their lifestyle to build their own reaction time, to build their peripheral vision, right? Because don't a lot of video games require you to be looking at your health and, establishing how much ammo or whatever you need for the game is still there. So for an older person, that's a great thing to add into your repertoire to help build up some of these things that naturally wane. It's not going to be this case that for those of you who are, 20 and you're playing video games all the time, that when you're 60, oh gosh, this will really stave off declines, because what will happen is your body and brain are used to you having played that your whole life. You're going to need to do something else to stave off the natural declines in reaction time. But again, this 20% decline, most people don't notice it. It is oftentimes compensated for by their greater experience in driving, for example, those kinds of things. Now, the complex motor skills, speaking of driving, we see this gradual decline and, this experience being able to compensate. So yeah, it might take an older person, 60-year-old, longer to take their foot off the gas and put it onto the brake. But because they've got more experience driving than, let's say, a 20-year-old, the 60-year-old probably saw what was likely to be coming up ahead of them that would require them to brake, before the 20-year-old did, because they have more experience and they could see the patterns that imply that, oh, traffic's probably about to get ready to stop in front of me. I better get my foot off the gas ahead of time. And so the 60-year-old is less likely to have an accident than a 20-year-old, even though the 60-year-old has slower reaction time. So experience really can compensate for those kinds of things. All right, let's make a rough transition into a discussion of sexuality. And first off, let's start with some of the myths. Common myth that if you were to get married, you're never having sex again. That's a really common myth. And in fact, I found book covers that actually had been on my mom's bookshelf when I was growing up. My parents had a very extensive set of bookshelves. Maybe some of your parents had that too, with all sorts of books that I don't know if they even had read them all or if they just liked to own them. I'm not sure. But one of them was, is there sex after marriage? And it was a common belief, especially, in my parents' generation for sure, that, once you got married, you didn't have sex anymore, obviously. And so they had to write books about that to encourage people. Yes, you can have sex even after you've gotten married. No sex after kids. So, if you thought, okay, no, I think I'm supposed to have sex after marriage. Well, once the kids come along, they're going to ruin everything. You're never going to have sex again. Who has time? Who has the instinct? Who even wants to? That's a really common myth about sexuality in adulthood, is that, once kids are there. I would like to argue that a lot of families have more than one kid. So obviously some sex happens after kids. Like, it seems self-evident to me that sex occurs after kids. And then another really common myth is that, after 40, people aren't having sex. I was just watching Family Feud, and the question was, how old would a man be when he loses interest in having sex? And one of the respondents said 35. Everybody in the audience, of course, laughed because that's ridiculous, but that's not that far off of the myth, is it? That there's no sex after 40. Obviously, all of these are myths. They are completely faulty. People have sex at different stages of life, and, getting married or having kids doesn't preclude you from having sex, that's for sure. In fact, here is a graph that shows you the frequency of sex by age. So you see the age across the x-axis. And then by marital status. And it's kind of a little tricky to see on the screen, but married men are the blue line. So you see them here. So these are married men. The pink line is married women. And then you have unmarried men in the yellow line here. And then you have unmarried women in the blue line here. Now, this is a cross-sectional study, so we're not comparing a person when they're 18 to 20 to themselves when they're 50 to 53. So that's how you can get some of these weird variations of leaping and stuff. But basically what you're seeing is that on average, married men and women are having more sex than unmarried men and women. You can see that on average, men are having more sex in older age than women are having in older age. One of the issues with that is that there on average is fewer men in the older age brackets, and so they have more options available to them. You'll notice that these unmarried women, elderly women, are not having very much sex at all, and they may not have many options. And they also, it might be, their morality, their belief system about, unmarried sex. But what I think is really super important is to focus on, here we are, we'll call this the 24-26 age bracket. Let's call that the beginning of adulthood. And then let's go over here to 64-66 as the end of that period. And really, there's not much, there's some decline. The frequency index obviously goes down. There's some decline, but it's not, dropping off of a cliff. And imagine that for the average person between 25 and 65, they've had children. We see clearly that some of these people are married and some are not. Some of them are over 40 and some are not. But I don't see anybody saying, with the exception of maybe the women here who are 70 plus and unmarried, really nobody's at the frequency index of 0 in the age bracket that we're talking about. Like, people are having sex in their adult years, that's for sure. The most sex of our lives is going to tend to be in our, early adulthood, emerging adulthood especially, and then into early adulthood. Being married gives you access to a partner, so that's one of the reasons why you see higher rates. But so that's my positivity on the role of sex across this age bracket, and then even across different life changes that you might stereotypically think might have a negative impact on sexual activity. All right, let's take a break here and we will come back and talk about sexual responsiveness in the next segment.